hadn't been out to the cabin in years. My dog, Hank, and I used to go up there every fall. It was the perfect place to get away from everything. Secluded, quiet, just a simple one-room cabin in the middle of the woods. It was on the edge of a national forest in the Pacific Northwest. I used to love it there, the crisp mountain air and the sound of nothing but the wind and the trees. But after the divorce, things changed. I stopped going. I was 35 now, a few years older and a lot more worn down. I'd had Hank since he was a pup, and now, at 8, he was still as spry as ever. He was a German shepherd, sturdy and smart, with a coat that glistened in the sun. His ears always perked up whenever something wasn't right, and I trusted him more than anyone else. I decided it was time to return. I needed space to clear my head. The divorce had hit me hard, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just for me. So, I packed up the truck, grabbed Hank's leash, and headed for the cabin. The drive took about 3 hours, and the closer I got, the more the road narrowed. The thick trees seemed to close in, the air became heavier, and there was a strange stillness. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting everything in that deep, purple twilight. The cabin looked the same. Nothing had changed in the 10 years since I was last there. The roof sagged just a bit, and the porch was weathered, but it still held the charm it had always had. I unloaded my bags and set Hank's bed up in the corner of the cabin. He immediately sniffed around, like he was looking for something or someone. His tail stiffened for a moment, and he barked once, but I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the place. He calmed down quickly after that. I built a fire in the small stove, the kind that heats up the whole cabin quickly, and settled into the worn armchair near the fire. The crackle of the wood was comforting, and Hank curled up at my feet, resting his head on my boot. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the trees, but that was normal. It was always windy up here. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I added more logs to the fire and listened to the occasional thump of a branch falling somewhere in the distance. It was peaceful, but then something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly. It was a nagging feeling, like the quiet had grown too heavy. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't used to feeling uneasy here. This place had always felt like home. But Hank was getting restless again, standing up and walking to the door, his ears twitching. I watched him, and he barked softly, low in his throat. I opened the door and looked out into the dark forest, but I couldn't see anything. The moon was high, but it was hidden behind thick clouds, and the trees stood tall and menacing in the shadows. I couldn't even see the edge of the porch from where I was standing. It was the kind of dark that swallows everything. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, but Hank wouldn't settle. He paced back and forth, occasionally stopping to sniff at the door. I could feel my nerves start to tighten, and I looked around the room as if expecting something to jump out. I grabbed a flashlight and walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. Everything was locked, but that creeping feeling wouldn't go away. I kept Hank close, and as I walked back into the main room, I caught a glimpse of something outside the window. A shadow, too tall to be a normal animal. My heart skipped a beat. It was like someone was standing just out of sight, watching. I moved closer to the window and shined the light outside. Nothing. But as I turned away, I heard it. Footsteps, light but deliberate, coming from the edge of the woods. I froze, my pulse racing. Hank growled low, the sound vibrating in his chest. He was on edge now, his hackles raised. I tried to ignore the rising panic in my chest. There was no reason to be scared. It was probably just a bear or a deer. Animals wandered through the area all the time. But the footsteps, they didn't sound like an animal. I grabbed my rifle from its place by the door. I hadn't planned on needing it, but I wasn't going to take chances. I quietly moved to the door, trying not to make a sound, and I opened it just a crack. Hank was tense, standing at my side, his eyes locked on the dark outside. The footsteps had stopped, and I couldn't hear anything now. My breath came in shallow gasps. I strained my ears, waiting for some sign of movement. Then I saw it. Someone moving quickly between the trees, just beyond the cabin. It wasn't an animal. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my ears. The sound of heavy breathing, mine or Hank's, filled the room. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed the flashlight and the rifle, my mind racing through options. If I was going to confront whatever it was, I had to do it carefully. I wasn't sure if it was a hunter, a lost hiker, or something else entirely. But then, a loud bang echoed through the air, something striking the side of the cabin. I jumped back, the rifle nearly falling from my hands. It was followed by another bang, closer this time. My blood ran cold. There was someone on the other side of the cabin, deliberately trying to make noise to get my attention. Hank barked, his voice sharp and commanding. He was ready, alert, and I felt a flicker of reassurance. I wasn't alone. I stepped toward the window, the rifle clutched tightly. I had to know what was out there. I eased the curtain back just enough to get a glimpse. The figure was still there, lurking at the edge of the woods, but now I could see him more clearly. He was tall, hunched, and dressed in dark clothes. The way he moved wasn't natural, almost as though he was trying to hide, but not quite succeeding. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no reason for someone to be out here in the woods, especially this late at night. This wasn't a place for casual strolls. I knew I had to leave. The cabin might be my refuge, but it wasn't going to protect me from a determined stranger. I moved quickly, packing up what I could in a bag. My hands shook as I tried to remain calm. Hank stood at my side, his eyes never leaving the door. He knew something was wrong, but I could sense he was waiting for my lead. I wasn't going to risk it. I made my way out the back, keeping low, trying to stay out of sight. As I reached the truck, I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was still there, standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't hesitate. I threw my bags in the truck, jumped in with Hank, and sped off, the tires crunching on the gravel. The road back to civilization felt longer than ever. The further I got, the more I felt the weight lift from my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The wind howled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps. By the time I reached the main road, the feeling was gone. But I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever be able to go back to that cabin, or if there was something or someone still out there in the dark. It was late October, and I had decided to escape the city for a while. I had no real plan, no intention to do anything fancy, just a quiet getaway. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a little solitude, a few days of reading, some quiet reflection. So, I rented this old cabin up near a small town called Lowfield. It sat right on the edge of an old graveyard. Nothing too eerie, just a handful of weathered gravestones from the 1800s. The kind of place that wasn't creepy, but made you feel like you were walking on the edge of history. The cabin itself was isolated, sitting on a steep hill just past the graveyard. It wasn't big, just a small one-room structure with a single window that looked out over the cemetery. The owner, an older man named George, had warned me about the spot being remote, but it didn't bother me. I was looking for isolation after all. As I arrived, the late afternoon sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The place had that musty, old scent, with the slight tang of wet wood from the recent rain. The wooden steps creaked as I climbed up, and the door groaned as I opened it. Inside, it was even more rustic than I had expected. Just a simple wooden floor, a small bed, a rickety kitchen table, and a fireplace that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. I spent the first night quietly. It was peaceful, too peaceful actually. The wind howled through the trees outside, but inside the cabin, there was a strange, unnerving silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. I kept myself busy by making dinner and reading a book I had brought along. The night passed without incident, but something felt off. The graveyard, which I had paid no mind earlier, seemed closer now. The dark, twisting branches of the trees beyond the window seemed to reach toward the cabin as if trying to pull it into the earth. By the second day, I started to feel uneasy. The graveyard was too close for comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The weather had taken a turn, 2 dark clouds rolled in, and a thick fog began to settle in the evening, wrapping the cabin in a damp, heavy mist. The kind of fog that blurs everything in a way that makes the world feel small and contained. I couldn't even see the graveyard clearly from the cabin anymore, just vague shapes looming in the distance. That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around. I didn't want to sit in the cabin all day, and maybe I just needed to clear my head. I bundled up in a jacket and made my way out. The path through the woods was narrow and overgrown. The trees were tall and dense, their branches twisting above me like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, and the air had that thick, earthy scent that you only get in places where no one's walked in a while. I walked toward the edge of the graveyard, trying not to think about how close I was getting to it. The weather had worsened, and the mist was thickening. I had just reached the old iron gate of the cemetery when I heard something, a faint rustling like footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks. It wasn't the wind. This sound was too deliberate, too slow. My heart skipped a beat, but I couldn't see anyone, not in this fog. I glanced around, my breath forming little clouds in the cold air. But the only thing I could make out was the vague shape of the gravestones, half obscured in the mist. I told myself it was nothing, maybe an animal, maybe just the wind again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't stick around for long. I turned and walked back toward the cabin, a little quicker than I had come out. The footsteps, or whatever they were, seemed to follow me, but I wasn't going to turn around to check. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and stayed inside for the rest of the day. The night was quieter, but it felt far more oppressive. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows, but the fog outside had thickened to the point that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. I found myself sitting near the window, staring out at the nothingness. A part of me wondered if I was just imagining things, but another part of me couldn't deny the strange, unsettling feeling that hung in the air. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the graveyard or the strange sounds. It was the silence in the cabin itself. It was almost too quiet, like the whole world outside had been muffled by the fog. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the cabin. Light, rhythmic tapping. It was so soft, I almost thought it was just my imagination, but it kept going. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound came from the window, no, not the window, from just outside the cabin. My blood ran cold. It was as if someone was lightly knocking on the wall. I lay there in the dark, frozen, too scared to move. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but it felt like hours. The tapping stopped, only to start again, a little louder this time. I could hear the scraping sound of something dragging across the wooden wall. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The thought of going out into the fog at night terrified me more than staying put. Finally, after what felt like forever, the tapping stopped. The cabin was silent again, except for the sound of my own breathing. I waited for what seemed like an eternity before I forced myself to get up. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and cautiously approached the door. With trembling hands, I opened it and stepped outside, the light from the flashlight shaking in my grip. The fog was thicker than ever. I walked around the cabin, trying to find the source of the noise, but I saw nothing. The graveyard was invisible in the thick mist, the gravestones swallowed up by the fog. The only sound was the creaking of the trees swaying in the wind. I don't know what made me do it, but I walked toward the cemetery again. The fog seemed to part just enough to reveal a small, indistinct shape moving among the gravestones. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was more like a shadow, darting between the tombstones, quick and erratic. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow stopped for a moment, and I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't make out any details. My heart pounded, but something told me I had to stay still, that leaving would be worse. Then, without any warning, the shape darted off into the fog, vanishing completely. I waited there for a long time, not daring to move. Slowly, I turned and walked back toward the cabin, the fog closing in behind me like a heavy curtain. When I got back inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. I didn't sleep much that night. The whole experience felt like a bad dream, but I knew I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something that wasn't quite human. The next morning, the fog was gone, and the sun was shining again. The graveyard looked almost peaceful in the daylight, with the gravestones bathed in soft light. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, unsure if I should leave. But eventually, the sun began to set, and I packed my things and left. I didn't want to spend another night there, not after what I'd felt. I never did find out what caused that tapping or who or what was out there in the fog. But I haven't gone back to Lowfield since. That place, it still gives me chills when I think about it. The sun was dipping low behind the trees as I walked down the dirt path leading deeper into the woods. I'd been hiking for hours, my legs sore and my breath coming out in quick bursts as the air got thinner with the higher elevation. I wasn't exactly lost, but I wasn't sure where I was anymore either. The phone had died hours ago, and the only thing guiding me now was the sound of wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional call of birds overhead. I had decided on a solo trip for the weekend to get away from everything. Work, city life, people. Just me, nature, and the peace that came with being away from all that. But as the sun sank lower, I began to feel an unease creeping over me. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The woods around me seemed to swallow up any sound. The chirping of the birds, the rustling of the leaves, even the wind. It all faded until it was just me and the sound of my own footsteps on the damp earth. That's when I saw it. Off in the distance, through the trees, there was a shape that didn't belong. It looked like a cabin, old and abandoned, barely visible against the backdrop of thick trees and underbrush. The roof sagged, one of the windows was shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Something about it was off. But it was still a cabin, and I needed shelter for the night. So, without thinking, I made my way toward it. The closer I got, the more the place seemed to loom over me. The wood was weathered, cracked in places, and the paint, if there had ever been any, was long gone. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, maybe even decades. Still, I was desperate for a place to sleep. The night was coming quickly, and I didn't want to risk being out here with nothing but trees around me. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell of mildew and old wood hit me immediately. The inside was dark, with only slivers of light cutting through the gaps in the walls. The floors were covered in dust and broken furniture, and the air felt thick, stagnant. I stepped carefully inside, making sure not to trip over anything. I didn't want to stay here for long, but it was a shelter, and that's all I needed for the night. I set my bag down near the fireplace, which had long since gone cold. There was a rusted stove in the corner, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I checked the windows. Most were boarded up, but there was still one that had a broken pane, giving me a clear view of the surrounding trees. The darkness was already starting to close in. As I began to settle in, I noticed something strange. There were signs of someone having been here not too long ago. Footprints, still visible in the dust on the floor, leading toward the back of the cabin. But they weren't just the usual dirt smudges you'd expect from someone walking around. They were heavy, like boots, and deep enough to be fresh. I stood there for a moment, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere in a cabin like this? I checked the door again, still closed. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak with every gust. I could feel the chill settling in, even though the fire had long since died out. I decided it was better to stay inside than risk the cold. Hours passed, and the wind outside only grew stronger. I lay on the floor, wrapped in my jacket, trying to sleep, but the unease I felt earlier hadn't left. I kept hearing things, scratching sounds, soft thuds coming from the back of the cabin. At first, I tried to brush it off as the wind or the building settling, but it didn't stop. The longer I listened, the more it felt like someone was moving around back there, pacing, almost like they were waiting for something. I got up and moved cautiously toward the back of the cabin. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I felt every step, every movement, echoing through the empty space. The scratching sound was louder now, almost like it was coming from the walls themselves. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why would anyone be out here? As I reached the back of the cabin, I stopped cold. The floor here was even more disturbed, with more footprints leading into a small room I hadn't noticed before. The door to it was cracked open, and I could feel the air growing colder, even though it had been fine just a moment ago. There was something in there, something that wasn't right. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a loud screech. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. There was a single chair in the corner, overturned, and a table with papers scattered across it. I didn't look at the papers at first. My eyes went straight to the corner, where I saw something that made my heart stop. Bloodstains, still wet, smeared across the floor. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and for a moment, I didn't know if I was going to collapse or run. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. Something had happened here, something violent. But who, and why was it so recent? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in these woods. I ran back to the main room, grabbed my bag, and bolted for the door. The night was colder now, the wind sharper as I stepped outside. I needed to leave now, but as I turned to head back down the path, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure, tall, with dark clothes that blended into the shadows. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't move. I wasn't sure if I should run or wait, but either way, I wasn't going to stick around. I turned back toward the cabin, but before I could take another step, I heard the crunch of boots on the dirt behind me. Someone was following me. Panic surged through my veins. I started running, ignoring the branches that slapped against my face, ignoring the pain in my legs. I just had to get out of here. I had to make it back to the main road to civilization before it was too late. It felt like I was running for hours, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare look back to see if they were still behind me. I pushed through the woods, ignoring the exhaustion, the fear that kept trying to creep into my mind. I kept thinking about the cabin, the blood, the footprints, and that figure. The more I thought about it, the more certain I was that whatever had happened in that cabin was still out there, waiting. Eventually, I broke free from the woods, emerging onto a small road. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in gasps. I looked back, but there was nothing. The woods were silent, and I couldn't hear a thing. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, where I found a payphone and called a cab. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just stumbled onto an abandoned cabin in the woods. I had walked into something that shouldn't have been disturbed. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of footsteps in the woods behind me, and I can't help but wonder who or what was following me that night. It was the kind of early autumn day that reminded me why I enjoyed getting out into the woods. Cool air, crisp enough to cut through my jacket, but not so biting that it made me want to turn around and head back home. My name's Jake, and I'd been planning this trip for months. A solo hunting trip to an old cabin out in the middle of nowhere, just me and the woods. It was an isolated spot in central Idaho, about 5 hours from Boise, near a small creek that had always seemed promising for game. I drove up the winding gravel road, the sound of rocks pinging off my truck's undercarriage almost rhythmic. The trees grew thicker the further I went, and before long, the road became nothing more than a rough trail that only a four-wheel drive truck could manage. I was used to this kind of driving, but it still made my stomach knot a little. It was already late in the afternoon, and the sun was starting to dip behind the ridge. When I pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, I felt that familiar quiet wash over me. It was perfect. The cabin wasn't much. A small, weathered two-room building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The roof was covered in moss, and the wood of the walls was a faded gray, almost blending in with the surrounding trees. I could hear the wind rustling through the pines, and that was about it. No sounds of civilization, just the way I liked it. I unloaded my gear, set up my rifle on the porch, and started a fire in the small stove inside the cabin. As the flames crackled, I unpacked some canned beans and opened a bottle of whiskey, my one small luxury on trips like these. There was a kind of solitude here that you couldn't find anywhere else. No rush, no noise, just the sounds of the forest and the steady beat of my heart as I sat there, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whip outside. The first night passed without much event. I spent the evening watching the fire flicker and imagining the animals I'd be hunting in the morning. By the time I went to bed, the moon had risen, casting an eerie glow through the cracks in the cabin's walls. I wasn't exactly scared, this was my element, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Maybe it was the way the trees moved in the wind or the low growl of distant thunder, but there was something unsettling about the stillness of it all. I woke up around dawn the next day, my breath visible in the cold air. The fire had died down to embers, and a thick fog clung to the ground, making everything look ghostly. I grabbed my rifle, checked the scope, and made sure the safety was off. It was time to head out. I didn't need to track much. I'd heard a buck the night before, and I was hoping he hadn't gone too far. The fog was thick and visibility was low, which actually worked in my favor. I knew the area well enough to navigate by the feel of the land underfoot. As I trekked deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake that strange feeling again, like something was off. It wasn't just the isolation of the place. There was a presence. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, but I shrugged it off. I was alone, just me and the woods. Around midday, I finally spotted a doe grazing near a patch of thick brush. I took a deep breath, crouched low, and carefully lined up my shot. Just as I was about to pull the trigger, something moved in my peripheral vision. Something big. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I'd been so focused on the doe that I hadn't noticed anything else around me. Turning slowly, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a man, standing just at the edge of the tree line. He was too still, too silent, and that's when the fear hit me. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and standing in the shadows, almost like he was trying to blend into the trees. I couldn't make out his features, just the outline of his figure. My first instinct was to raise my rifle, but I hesitated. What was a man doing out here? I hadn't seen anyone on my drive-in, and this was supposed to be an isolated area. The moment seemed to stretch, and my breath came in short gasps as I debated what to do. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, and I started to wonder if maybe he wasn't real. Maybe I was imagining things. The fog made everything seem off-kilter, and the longer I stared, the more surreal it felt. But then he took a step toward me. I quickly ducked behind a large pine, keeping my rifle aimed at the spot where I'd seen him. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and if this guy had bad intentions, there was no one to help me. The thought of being out there so far from anything familiar sent a chill up my spine. My breath quickened as I tried to steady myself. After what felt like an eternity, I risked a quick peek around the tree. The figure had vanished. The silence was thick again, and I wasn't sure if it had ever really been broken. I couldn't see him anywhere. The fog had swallowed him up, just like it swallowed the rest of the world. I waited a while longer, my heart still racing. Then I decided to keep moving. I had to get back to the cabin, figure out what was going on. I made my way back carefully, eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle in the trees. It took longer than it should have, and when I finally reached the cabin, I felt a sense of relief flood over me. But something was wrong. The door, which had been closed when I left, was now slightly ajar. I didn't open it when I left, and I was sure of it. I crept inside, rifle ready, but the cabin was empty. Nothing was disturbed. The fire pit was cold, and my gear sat where I'd left it. But that strange, heavy feeling didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the trees. I spent the rest of the day inside, checking the perimeter of the cabin and making sure there was no sign of anyone else. By nightfall, I was starting to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was just jumpy from the isolation and the eerie quiet, but as I sat by the fire, I heard it again. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps crunching the dry leaves outside. I jumped to my feet, rifle raised. My heart pounded in my chest as the noise grew louder, closer. But this time, it wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were two. I didn't know what was happening, but I wasn't about to wait around to find out. I grabbed my pack, shoved everything into it, and ran out of the cabin. The fog was thicker than ever, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to make my way back to the truck. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and saw the headlights of my truck in the distance. I threw open the door and jumped inside, heart still pounding as I slammed it shut behind me. I started the engine, fishtailed a little on the gravel, and then gunned it out of there. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Looking back, I can't explain exactly what happened that day. There were no signs of anyone else when I left the cabin, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, or maybe I wasn't the only one who knew about that old cabin. Whatever it was, I don't plan on going back. That trip was supposed to be a retreat, a quiet break from everything. Instead, it left me with more questions than answers, and a gnawing feeling that I'd been closer to something dangerous than I'd ever realized. I haven't told anyone what happened, not even my friends back home. There's no proof of what I saw, nothing that could explain the feeling of being watched. Maybe it's better that way. I don't think I'll be going on any more solo trips in the woods anytime soon. The woods have a way of making you feel small, and sometimes that's a feeling you don't want to mess with. I had been planning this trip for months, an escape from the chaos of my life. The city had grown suffocating, and I needed to get away from it all. I wasn't interested in a luxury retreat or staying in some busy, tourist-filled spot. I wanted solitude, the kind that could only be found deep in the woods. So, I booked a cabin in the outskirts of the Adirondacks, just about a 3-hour drive from where I lived in upstate New York. The kind of place where the air is thick with pine and the only sounds you hear are the wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife. The place I rented was small but cozy, nestled among towering trees and miles away from the nearest town. I'd gotten the keys from a neighbor who lived a few miles away. He didn't speak much, only handed me the keys and gave me a quick wave before disappearing into his house, leaving me to my own devices. I wasn't concerned about that, though. Most people in these rural areas tended to keep to themselves. I pulled up to the cabin around dusk. The building itself was a modest, one-story structure made of weathered wood, with a small porch and a single, darkened window. The first thing I noticed as I approached was the silence. There were no sounds of birds or animals, nothing but the occasional rustling of the trees. The place had an unsettling stillness to it, but I didn't pay too much attention to it. I figured it was just the isolation. Quiet comes naturally in remote places. I stepped inside, and the creak of the old wooden floors welcomed me. The cabin smelled of dust and aged timber, and the faint scent of what seemed like pine resin filled the air. The furnishings were simple. A couch, a small wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with an old refrigerator, and a bathroom with a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in ages. There were also a few chairs scattered around, including one near the window that had a view of the dense forest surrounding the property. I spent the next hour unpacking and setting up my things. It wasn't until I got comfortable and made myself a cup of tea that I began to feel the weight of the silence. It was as if the world had shut down, and I was the only person left. I decided to take a walk around the area to stretch my legs before it got completely dark. As I stepped outside, the temperature had dropped significantly, and a chill ran down my spine. The sun was setting fast, and the forest around the cabin appeared darker than usual, like the trees were closing in. It was a beautiful place, no doubt about it, but there was something almost unnatural about the stillness. I ventured a little deeper into the woods, the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots the only sound. The trees towered above me, their trunks thick and gnarled, some twisted in ways that made them look like they were reaching out to grab me. The sun dipped lower, and the shadows grew longer. I kept walking, trying to push past the unease that was creeping up my spine. It wasn't that I felt threatened, but there was this vague sense that something was watching me from the darkness. After a while, I turned back, figuring it would be best to return to the warmth of the cabin before nightfall. When I got back, the sun had almost completely disappeared, leaving only the last bits of twilight behind. The cabin seemed to loom in the dimming light, its outline sharp against the fading glow. I spent the next few hours alone, cooking a simple meal and reading a book by the dim light of the cabin's single lamp. The wind picked up outside, making the trees sway. It was nice at first, the kind of peaceful noise that usually put me at ease. But then, in the midst of the howling gusts, I heard something that made me freeze mid-sentence. It was a faint sound at first, just a soft scraping noise, like something moving slowly across the ground. I turned off the lamp and sat still, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise grew louder, and it was then I realized that it was coming from just outside the cabin. Someone or something was moving around. The sound was irregular, dragging, and it gave me chills. I got up and peered out the window, but the darkness was too thick to make anything out. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but the sound stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever had been there had just vanished. I waited for a while longer, but nothing else came. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe it was just an animal or the wind. I turned the lights back on and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. The wind outside howled louder than before, making the walls shake. But I eventually drifted off, the exhaustion of the day catching up with me. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound from outside. It was unmistakable, like someone was hitting the side of the cabin with something heavy. My pulse raced, and I lay there in the darkness, frozen. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a bear, or even a tree branch banging against the wood. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I hardly slept a wink. The next morning, I decided to head back to town to pick up a few supplies, just to get out of the cabin for a bit. The trip was uneventful, and by the time I returned, the sun was high in the sky. I was unpacking the groceries when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints leading up to the door of the cabin. They were fresh too, just made within the last few hours. I hadn't seen anyone around when I left, and it made no sense. The tracks were too wide and uneven to be animal prints, and they didn't look like they came from anyone I knew. They seemed to stop right at the door, as though whoever it was had been standing there, waiting for me to return. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The stillness outside felt even more oppressive now. As dusk began to fall, I locked the doors and windows and decided to stay inside for the night. I didn't want to risk going out into the woods again. That evening, the unsettling noises came back. I heard soft scratching at the door. Not a knock, but the deliberate sound of something or someone dragging across the wood. My mind raced and I pulled out the phone to call the neighbor. But as I dialed, I realized that I had no service. Of course, I hadn't thought to check earlier. With no way to reach anyone, I was left alone with whatever or whoever was out there. The scratching continued, growing louder, closer, until it was directly outside the door. I stood frozen in place, barely breathing. The silence followed, and then I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. The pressure in the air seemed to lift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, watching from the shadows. The next morning, I packed my things and left before the sun even fully rose. The woods that had seemed so inviting a couple of days ago now felt suffocating. I didn't care to find out who or what had been outside my cabin, or what their intentions were. I just wanted to get back to the safety of the city. The experience still lingers in my mind. I know I'll never return to that cabin. Something in the woods felt off, and even though I didn't see anyone, I know someone was there. I won't forget those footprints outside my door. Sometimes, when I'm out walking, I still feel like someone is following me, waiting in the trees. I've always liked to get away from it all. That's why I decided to head up to a small cabin in the middle of nowhere in the Adirondacks. I'd rented the place through a small, local listing a few weeks ago. No one else was supposed to be around for miles, or so I thought. It was supposed to be the perfect spot for some quiet and solitude. No distractions, no noise, just me, the forest, and the feeling of being alone with my thoughts. The drive up was long, taking me through winding roads surrounded by dense trees. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the land. The cabin sat on a small hill with a creek running down beside it. The area looked almost untouched by time. Just old trees, moss-covered rocks, and that unmistakable stillness you only get when you're far from civilization. The place was exactly what I was looking for. I unpacked my truck quickly, carrying my bags into the small wooden structure. The cabin was rustic, barely bigger than a one-bedroom apartment with a few windows, a small kitchen, and a wood stove in the middle of the living area. The furniture looked old but solid. There were shelves on the walls filled with dusty books, and the faint smell of wood and age filled the air. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy, and that was all I needed. I didn't expect any neighbors or nearby distractions. The last thing I wanted was to deal with people, especially strangers, in a secluded place like this. I took a deep breath, let the peace of the woods sink into my chest, and began to settle in. As the evening wore on, the sky darkened quickly. The temperature dropped as the last bits of daylight faded, and I made sure to get the fire going in the wood stove. The crackling warmth spread through the cabin, and I started to relax. But something about the quietness began to gnaw at me. It wasn't the usual peaceful silence that I'd hoped for. There was something off, a sort of presence in the air. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. I decided to make some dinner, just a simple stew, and sit by the fire, read a little, and enjoy the night. But as I was eating, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd hear something faint, an odd sound like a twig snapping or a far-off rustle. But each time I looked out the windows, there was nothing. The woods were just dark and still. I told myself it was nothing, just animals moving around. After all, it was the forest, and that was to be expected. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The real unease came when the sun had fully set, and the darkness felt more absolute. There wasn't a moon, so it was pitch black outside, and the cabin's single light didn't do much to cut through it. I was sitting in the living room, staring into the fire, when I heard a knock on the door. It wasn't loud, but it was there. I froze. My heart jumped into my throat. Who the hell would be out here? There were no other cabins around, no roads, just miles of forest. I stood up, the hairs on my neck standing on end. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Maybe it was just a trick of my mind, the wind, something. But then, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to ignore it, to lock the doors and stay put. But something in the back of my mind told me that I needed to check. Slowly, I moved toward the door, my hands trembling. When I opened it, there was nothing, not a single person in sight. The porch was empty, the forest silent. But that silence was thick, oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. My heart was racing now, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my back. The sound of the knock still echoed in my ears. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. It didn't make sense. If someone was out there, why hadn't they said anything? Why was it so quiet? I closed the door, double-checking the lock. There was no wind, no animals, just an unnatural stillness that felt like it was wrapping itself around the cabin. The next few hours felt like they dragged on forever. Every small noise in the house made me jump. The sound of the floor creaking under my own footsteps, the pop of the fire. But there was something else, something not natural. It was like a slow, steady rhythm coming from outside. I couldn't place it, but it was consistent. It was almost as if something was walking around the cabin. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the wind or an animal. Maybe it was a deer, a bear, anything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was circling the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the dark, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footsteps in the dirt. Nothing. I shone the light in every direction, but it was just the same empty woods. But the feeling of being watched, that was still there. I could feel it in my bones, the prickling sense that something wasn't right. I went back inside and locked the door, still shaken. I kept the flashlight on the table beside me, ready to grab it in case I needed to check again. The hours crawled by, the fire burning low. The sounds from outside seemed to intensify, like something was getting closer. Then, just as I was about to settle into a restless sleep, I heard it again. Another knock, a loud, deliberate thud on the door. I didn't even hesitate this time. I was already on my feet, flashlight in hand, ready to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But when I opened the door, there was nothing, just the empty night. No footprints, no sounds, just the relentless dark. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, but something in my gut told me that I wasn't safe. Something was out there. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to leave. I grabbed my things, not caring if I made noise. I wasn't about to stick around. I pulled out of the driveway and onto the gravel road, my headlights cutting through the dark. The trees loomed over me, stretching their twisted branches across the road like fingers. By the time I reached the nearest town, it was well past midnight. I stopped at the first gas station I saw and told the attendant about the cabin. He gave me a strange look but didn't say much else. He just nodded, saying the cabin had been empty for months, maybe even years, ever since the last owner disappeared. I didn't wait to ask for details. I just got back in my truck and drove, leaving that empty cabin and the woods behind me. I never went back. I never thought I'd be here again, the place where I spent so many years. Some good, mostly bad, but always full of memories that never really left. It's been months since my divorce, and even though I should feel relief, a weight always presses on my chest when I think about it. His name was Mark, and we were married for a decade before everything fell apart. This cabin, tucked away in the mountains of northern Colorado, was supposed to be our sanctuary, a place where we could escape everything and just be ourselves. But over the years, it became a symbol of what went wrong in our lives. I hadn't been back since he left for good. I guess I never really intended to come back either, but there I was, standing at the foot of the gravel path leading up to the cabin. The familiar crunch of pebbles underfoot echoed in the quiet, and I couldn't help but notice how the trees had grown thicker around the cabin. It had always felt a little isolated, but now it felt almost suffocating, like the woods themselves were closing in on the place. The air smelled different too, thick and damp, the scent of pine and earth mingling in a way that was almost overwhelming. The cabin itself was still standing, though its once pristine exterior had aged poorly. The windows were fogged with years of dust, the paint chipped, and the wooden porch had seen better days. I should have sold it months ago, but something kept me from doing it. Maybe I needed to face it one last time. Maybe I needed to come to terms with what happened here. As I walked up the creaky porch steps, I hesitated before I reached for the door handle. The door was still locked. Mark had always been careful about security, and I guess he left it that way. I fumbled in my pocket for the key, the one I had kept all these years, just in case I ever needed it. I turned it slowly in the lock, the sound of metal scraping against metal sending a shiver up my spine. The door swung open with a groan, and I stepped inside, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was still as cold as I remembered. The fireplace, which we'd spent so many nights huddled around, now stood dormant, the hearth empty. The furniture was draped in old sheets, remnants of a life I had once known. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do next. Everything felt heavy. The silence in the cabin was deafening. I walked through the small living room and into the kitchen, my footsteps echoing off the wooden floors. The kitchen was just as I remembered it, cluttered with mismatched mugs and old pans, but now it felt so much smaller, so much emptier. I ran my hand along the counter, tracing the grooves in the wood that had been carved over the years. There was a spot where Mark used to leave his keys every day when he came home from work. That thought made my stomach tighten, and I quickly pulled my hand back, like I could shake off the memories. It was then I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air, something musty, like wet earth, mixed with a faint whiff of cigarette smoke. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, I checked the windows, half expecting to find one cracked open, but everything was sealed tight. It was just the two of us, and yet it felt like something else was here, something I couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to push away the unease creeping in. I needed to stop being so paranoid. Mark wasn't here. He wouldn't come back. I made my way to the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The upstairs bedroom was where it all happened, where the arguments escalated, where we finally broke. I hadn't stepped foot in that room since the night he left, and part of me didn't want to now. But I had to. I had to close this chapter of my life for good. I reached the top of the stairs, and the door to the bedroom was just as I left it, slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a slow, deliberate motion, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, and the faint scent of stale air hung in the space. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled in a way that seemed so familiar. The dresser had been left untouched, the drawer half open with the clothes spilling out onto the floor. Nothing had been moved, but something about the stillness of the room made it feel like the air was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stepped inside, taking in the sight of the room that had once been mine and Mark's. The memories of our time together flooded back in an instant, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I could almost hear the sound of his voice, feel his presence here, but it was fleeting, like a ghost I couldn't quite grasp. I walked to the window and peered out at the view of the valley below. The mountains loomed large in the distance, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky. It was a beautiful sight, but I couldn't help feeling small in the face of it all. The world was vast, and this little cabin, this one part of my life, seemed insignificant. Yet it held so much. I walked over to the closet, half expecting to find his things still there, but it was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, though it didn't last long. As I turned back to the room, I noticed something on the floor near the bed. A scrap of paper, yellowed and crumpled. I bent down to pick it up, and as I unfolded it, my heart skipped a beat. It was a note written in Mark's handwriting. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to read it. The words on the page were simple, almost meaningless, but they hit me like a punch in the gut.
I'm sorry.
I never meant for things to end like this. My hands shook as I held the paper, the weight of those words sinking in. I wanted to leave. I wanted to forget about the cabin, about everything. But as I turned to walk out of the room, I heard something, a faint thud coming from downstairs. I froze, my heart racing. My first instinct was to chalk it up to the wind or the house settling, but something told me it was more than that. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept down the stairs, every step slow and careful. The sound was louder now, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the noise stopped. It was like someone or something was waiting for me. I shone the light into the living room, but there was no one there. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, though the unease didn't leave. The cabin felt even more oppressive now, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but there was no one there. I turned and made my way to the front door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. That's when I saw it, a shadow just outside the window. I jerked back, my heart in my throat, but when I looked again, the shadow was gone. The door was still locked, the windows shut, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, lingered in the air like a thick fog. I didn't stick around to find out what was going on. I grabbed my things and left, locking the door behind me. As I walked back down the gravel path, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time. But the cabin remained still and silent, as it always had been. I didn't look back again. I had always been curious about the cabin in the woods. My dad had talked about it once or twice, always in passing, like it was something from his past he had long since left behind. But when my mom and he divorced, I found out that he had kept it, hidden away in some remote corner of the Appalachian Mountains, a place he went to get away from everything. He never talked much about his work, but I knew enough to understand that my father wasn't just your average guy. He had done things that weren't entirely legal, things that he probably regretted but could never fully shake. I never asked too many questions, but the day I found myself alone in that cabin, I realized I should have asked more. It was early fall, the air crisp and cool as I made the long drive down the winding road toward the cabin. I hadn't been there since I was a little kid. The overgrown trees on either side of the dirt path seemed to swallow the narrow road hole. The old redwood cabin appeared out of nowhere, the way it always did in my memories, as if the woods itself had spit it out. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. My dad's absence had left a mark on everything, and it was clear that he hadn't come out here in a long time. I stood there for a while, just staring at it, remembering the sound of the creek running nearby and the distant calls of animals. The world felt a little too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. When I walked inside, the smell of mildew hit me first. The wood inside was damp from years of neglect, but the cabin still had that eerie charm, like it was trying to remind me of something. The furniture was all covered with dusty sheets, and the wooden beams creaked underfoot with every step I took. I moved to the fireplace, which hadn't been used in ages, and started a small fire to chase away the chill. The flames crackled and danced, but something about the place felt wrong, even though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. As the night grew darker, the cabin grew quieter. I kept the fire going, though it wasn't enough to cut through the oppressive stillness. I'd planned to spend the night, maybe explore the woods a bit tomorrow, but as I sat there, a sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't just the isolation that bothered me, though it was enough to make me feel like I was being watched, but it was the place itself. Every creak and groan of the woods sounded too deliberate, as though it were trying to tell me something. I brushed it off as paranoia. My dad had used to say this place had a way of getting into your head, but he'd always said it like a joke. I decided to go to bed early, though sleep didn't come easy. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, and I lay there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it, the soft thump of something moving around outside. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like someone or something was moving around just outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I had locked the door when I came in, or at least I thought I had. But now I wasn't so sure. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath. The sounds grew closer, and I could hear the faint crunching of leaves beneath someone's feet. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was a deliberate quality to the sound, something calculated. I grabbed the flashlight next to my bed, shining it out the window toward the edge of the woods, but I couldn't see anything. The shadows were too thick, and the light couldn't pierce through them. I wasn't sure how much time passed before I heard the sound again. Closer now, just outside the cabin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt an overwhelming need to check the door. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and walked slowly toward the front door. I checked the lock, it was still secured. I felt a little ridiculous, but the thought of someone being out there, watching, made my stomach twist. That's when I saw it. A figure, or rather a shape, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall, and it didn't move like a person. It stood there, completely still, just watching the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. I tried to think rationally, but fear was already setting in. What was this person doing out here? Why were they so close? And why did they seem so familiar, though I couldn't place them? I backed away from the door slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just some wanderer or hiker, someone lost in the woods. But the figure didn't move, not an inch. It was as if it were waiting for me to make the first move. My dad had always said that the woods had a way of playing tricks on you, of making you think you saw things that weren't really there. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the flashlight on and watched through the window, but the figure was gone by the time I dared to look again. My mind raced, jumping from one possibility to the next. Had I imagined it? Was I just tired, seeing things in the dark? But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. The morning came, and with it, a small sense of relief. I decided to pack up and head home, maybe come back some other time when I was more prepared to figure out whatever had happened. But as I walked through the cabin, my eyes caught something I hadn't noticed before. A small leather-bound notebook tucked under the couch, its edges worn from years of use. I opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was unfamiliar but neat. There were details about the cabin, the land surrounding it, and something about the agent. My stomach churned. My dad had always kept his work close to the chest, but the words in the notebook hinted at something darker. The pages seemed to blur together, but one in particular stood out. It read, "Asterisk, if you see him, don't approach. Don't make any noise. He's been watching for years, waiting for the right moment." Asterisk, the last page had a single word underlined. Asterisk, escape. Asterisk, it was then that I realized the figure I had seen wasn't just some wanderer. It was someone connected to my dad's past, someone who had been watching this cabin for a long time. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew enough to understand that the woods weren't just a place for peace. They were a place of secrets, ones I wasn't ready to uncover. I left the cabin, not looking back, and as I drove away, I felt the weight of something heavy in the air, something I couldn't shake. That night, I locked my doors a little tighter. The world out there had a way of slipping past you when you weren't paying attention, and now I was certain I'd seen just a glimpse of it. I had been planning the trip for months, getting away from the constant noise of the city and into the quiet of nature. The idea was simple: to build a small cabin, something small enough to sleep in, but big enough to get away from everything. A quiet place to escape, to breathe, to think. I wasn't an expert carpenter by any means, but I'd spent enough time watching YouTube videos to feel confident about constructing a basic cabin. Besides, how hard could it be? I had the tools, the materials, and the time. The location was a remote stretch of land I'd bought a few years ago. An old, overgrown plot deep in the woods of Vermont, about 2 hours north of Burlington. It wasn't far from any town, but it still felt secluded. The land was bordered by thick pines, and the small creek that ran nearby was perfect for gathering water. It was early October when I finally made my way out there, the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and yellow, the cool fall air settling in. My plan was to spend the next few weeks building the cabin, but as soon as I arrived, I realized that I had seriously underestimated how hard it would be. I had enough materials to build the cabin, sure, lumber, insulation, nails, tools, but as soon as I stepped out of my truck and onto the muddy ground, I knew this was going to take longer than I expected. The weather was unpredictable, and as the sky darkened, I could feel the weight of a storm on the horizon. I unloaded what I could, but the rain started falling heavily soon after, as if nature itself was warning me to get moving. I rushed to get a tarp up, anything to keep my supplies dry. The storm hit with a sudden fury, thick sheets of rain pouring down in a constant deluge, the sound of the drops on the tarp deafening. I couldn't even hear myself think over the roar of the rain. By evening, the rain hadn't let up. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around me. The temperature was dropping fast. I was soaked, my clothes sticking to my skin. I knew I had to start a fire, but the wood I had stacked under the tarp was wet, and the dry kind I had left at the cabin site was useless. There was no way to light it without shelter. I thought of driving back to town, but that would take too long, and the storm wasn't letting up anytime soon. I had no choice but to huddle into the small shelter I'd managed to build from the tarp and a few boards. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Night fell quickly. I could feel the dampness creeping into my bones as I sat there, wrapped in my jacket, trying to stay warm. I hadn't expected the night to be this cold, especially with the rain pouring down and the wind howling. It was then that I noticed something strange: the smell. At first, I thought it was just the wet wood and the earth, but as the night went on, I realized it was something else. A sharp, unpleasant odor that seemed to get worse with the rain. Couldn't place it. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before, and it lingered in the air, filling my nose with each breath I took. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but there was nothing. The wind was blowing hard enough to carry the scent from the woods, so I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Maybe it was a dead animal somewhere, but I couldn't be sure. I checked my watch, almost midnight. I was exhausted, but there was no way I was going to get any sleep with the storm still raging. The darkness was pressing in on me, and the only sounds were the rain and the occasional crack of thunder. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, but the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel watched. It wasn't a logical feeling, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. The sound of something moving in the woods made me jump. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained my ears to listen. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rustle, the snap of a branch. Something was out there, moving in the dark. I froze, not daring to breathe. My eyes darted to the shadows, the rain falling harder now, drenching everything in its path. I grabbed a large piece of wood, one I could use as a makeshift weapon if I needed to. I knew it was stupid. There was nothing out there. I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't help myself. The sense of something lurking in the woods was too strong to ignore. The sound grew louder, closer. The rain had become so heavy that the ground was nearly flooded. It was hard to make out what was moving through the wet underbrush, but whatever it wasn't human. It was too deliberate in its movements, too careful. A low, guttural growl reached my ears, freezing me in place. It wasn't an animal sound. It was something else. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained my eyes into the dark, trying to see. The flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in pitch-black darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the trees. I heard the growl again. This time it was closer. It was unmistakable. I didn't wait for it to get any closer. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my pack, and bolted for the truck. The rain was coming down so hard that I could barely see where I was running, my shoes slipping in the mud. Every time I heard that growl, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a bear or a coyote. This was something different. I made it back to my truck, heart pounding in my chest, hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I started the engine, the headlights cutting through the rain. The growl echoed behind me again, closer than ever. My gut twisted with fear, and I slammed the truck into gear, throwing gravel behind me as I sped out of the campsite, leaving the cabin site behind. The rain kept falling, but it didn't matter anymore. I didn't look back, not once. By the time I got back to town, the storm had passed, and the sky was clear. The night was still calm, the air crisp. The cabin was still standing in my mind, but I knew one thing for certain. I would not be going back there. Whatever I heard that night, whatever it was that made my blood run cold, it was not something I wanted to face again. I never finished that cabin. In the end, I left the land behind, sold it to someone else who wanted to try their luck. The rain had cleared, but that smell, that growl, would stay with me forever. Maybe some things are better left in the dark. It was late September in the mountains of Northern California when I got the call to cover the ranger station for the weekend. Normally, I'd be at home, enjoying the crisp fall air and the quiet of the house, but the station needed someone, and I was the one they called. They said it'd be easy, just a few days of watching over the park, checking the trails, making sure the usual campfires didn't get out of hand. I'd been working as a park ranger for over 5 years, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. The cabin I was assigned to was a small, isolated one about a mile away from the main park entrance. It wasn't much. Wooden walls that creaked when the wind picked up, a wood stove in the corner, and a tiny bed that had seen better days. It was built to be practical, not comfortable, but I didn't mind. It was just me, a few supplies, and the quiet of the forest. I arrived around dusk, the sun sinking behind the tall pines as I parked my truck in front of the cabin. The air had already started to cool, and the rustling of leaves under the wind felt like something watching. I quickly gathered my gear and went inside. The place smelled like old pine and dust, nothing unusual for a cabin that had been left unused for most of the year. The first thing I did was check the logbook. It was standard procedure to record everything, weather, wildlife sightings, anything out of the ordinary. There were a few entries from previous rangers, mostly mundane stuff. Checked Trail 3, cleared debris, or found a broken fence near the creek. But the last entry caught my attention. Strange noises at night, felt watched, no sign of animals. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as the usual overactive imaginations that tended to creep up in the stillness of the forest. But still, a part of me wondered if it had anything to do with the rumors I'd heard about the area. Some locals whispered about strange happenings in these woods. Missing hikers, unexplained sounds in the night, but I didn't believe in any of that. I had a job to do. As the night crept in, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I tried to settle in, but something felt off. The cabin creaked more than it should have, as though it were alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it as the shadows playing tricks on me, and after dinner, I decided to get some rest. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of scratching. Soft at first, almost like the wind against the window, but then it grew louder, faster, scratching at the door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and stood still, listening. The noise continued, persistent and unnerving. I walked to the door, slowly, trying to steady my breath. The wind was still howling outside, but this sound, it was something different. I cracked the door open, shining my light into the dark. Nothing, just the night air and the rustling of the trees. I stepped outside, checking the area around the cabin. There were no signs of animals, no footprints, no disturbed ground. But the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I stood there for a moment, scanning the darkness. Then, just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed something odd. A small, shiny object glinting in the moonlight by the edge of the trees. I approached it carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was a pocket knife, old and well-worn, the kind you'd see on a hiker or hunter. I bent down to pick it up, inspecting the blade. It didn't look like it had been dropped recently. There was no fresh dirt on it, no signs of a struggle. But there was something unsettling about finding it there, so far from any trail. I decided to leave it where it was. Whoever had dropped it wasn't nearby anymore. I turned to head back to the cabin, but before I reached the door, I heard a sound. A footstep, soft but distinct, coming from the edge of the trees. I froze. It wasn't an animal. The step was too heavy, too deliberate. My heart started pounding again as I quickly rushed inside and bolted the door. I wasn't sure who or what was out there, but I wasn't about to take any chances. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I kept the lights on and the stove running, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't sleep, The next morning, I inspected the area around the cabin again, hoping to find something that would explain the night's events. But everything was still too still. The pocket knife was gone, as if it had never been there at all. There were no footprints, no broken branches, not even a sign of disturbed earth. It was as if the forest had swallowed everything. I tried to push the unease aside. I had a job to do. The trails needed checking, and I was determined to stay focused. So, I spent the day hiking through the park, marking down trail conditions, checking for hazards. But the sense of being watched never left me. I'd often catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, just a flicker in the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks. Each time, I'd stop and scan the area, but there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and on edge. I checked the logbook again, but nothing had changed. The same entry about strange noises. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine when I saw it. Was this place really as isolated as it seemed? Or was I missing something? That night, I kept the lights off. I wanted to see if the noises would return, to figure out what was causing them. I sat in the dark, the only sound the occasional crackle of the stove. Then, at around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the scratching. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window. I grabbed the flashlight and approached cautiously. I shone the light outside, but all I could see was darkness. I moved to the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of light swept across the yard, and then, just for a second, I saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, standing just outside the beam of light. I nearly dropped the flashlight in shock. My heart raced as I backed away from the window. Who was out there? I didn't dare open the door this time. Instead, I pulled the chair in front of the door, something I had never done before in all my years as a ranger. The night dragged on in silence after that. I didn't hear anything more, but I couldn't sleep. The figure I had seen was burned into my mind. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour? The next morning, I packed up my things and headed back to the ranger station. As I passed the spot where I'd found the pocket knife, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints leading into the woods. But they weren't human footprints. They were large, irregular, like someone or something had been walking on two legs but with a strange gait. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I had seen enough. Whoever or whatever had been out there was not something I wanted to confront. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the sense of unease remained, hanging in the air like the shadow of the trees that surrounded the cabin. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a weekend alone in the mountains of Colorado, in a secluded cabin, sounded perfect. No distractions, no work, just me and the wilderness. I didn't think much about the risks of being out there, alone in such a remote area. It was supposed to be a break, a chance to clear my head and disconnect. I was 32, young, but not naive. I'd done enough camping in my life to know what to do in an emergency. At least I thought I did. The cabin was nestled deep in the Rockies, far off the beaten path. No cell signal, no internet, just trees and rocks for miles around. When I finally found the place, after hours of driving, I felt a wave of relief. It was late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the jagged peaks. The cabin looked exactly like what I had pictured. Weathered wood, a small porch, and big windows that offered a perfect view of the mountains. I unloaded my gear and made myself at home. The cabin was small, but it had everything I needed. A wood-burning stove, a couple of chairs by the window, a small kitchen, and a large bed with thick quilts. I had the whole weekend to myself, and for a moment, I thought I might be the luckiest person alive. I decided to spend the evening outside, just sitting on the porch and taking in the scenery. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made you feel alive. As the sun set, the world turned a soft purple, and the last bit of warmth disappeared. I built a fire outside and sat by it, listening to the crackling of the logs. Everything felt so peaceful, so right. I hadn't been this relaxed in years. But as night fell, I started feeling a little uneasy. It was a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the woods. But every time I turned, there was nothing there, just the shadows of the trees dancing in the firelight. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling lingered, settling deep in my bones. I went inside, hoping that the warmth of the cabin would ease my nerves. I made a simple dinner and ate quietly, the sound of my fork scraping against the plate the only noise in the room. The fire in the stove was comforting, casting flickering shadows on the walls. But even inside, the feeling of being watched never fully went away. I tried to read for a while, but the book didn't hold my attention. I kept hearing small noises outside, things moving in the underbrush. Maybe it was just animals. There were plenty of wild creatures in the area. Still, the quiet of the night felt unnatural. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange sounds, scratching at the walls, soft taps on the windows. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but every now and then, I could have sworn I heard a low, guttural sound, something that didn't belong. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I finally fell asleep, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. In my dreams, I was back outside, sitting by the fire. I looked up, and standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, tall, dark, and unmoving. I couldn't make out its face, but something about the shape felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I woke with a start, heart racing, drenched in sweat. It was still dark outside, and I lay there wide awake, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I decided to get up, go outside for some air, and clear my head. I grabbed my jacket, pulled on my boots, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me like a punch in the gut, but I welcomed it. The night was deathly still, not even a breeze rustling the leaves. I stood there for a few moments, breathing in the cold, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then I heard it, a sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the woods. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was out there. I froze, trying to listen, trying to place the sound, but it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just an animal or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I glanced over to my truck parked on the dirt road. The headlights were off, but I could have sworn I saw a figure moving in the shadows, just outside the reach of the porch light. I ran inside and grabbed my flashlight. As I stepped out again, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the area around the cabin. There was no one there. The only movement was the flickering of the fire, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I thought about calling for help, but I realized I had no cell service. I couldn't even get a signal, no matter how hard I tried. It was just me out here, alone. I tried to shake the fear out of my mind, but it clung to me like a second skin. I decided to go back inside and lock the door, hoping that the safety of the cabin would calm my nerves. But before I could make it inside, I heard it again. This time, much closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel just beyond the porch. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. I raised the flashlight, pointing it toward the noise. The beam swept across the darkness, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the forest, silent and still. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to stay inside, lock the door, and wait until morning, but that didn't feel like a safe option anymore. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't going to just leave. I couldn't stay in this cabin another minute, feeling like a sitting duck. So I made a decision, a drive out. I grabbed my keys, stuffed them in my pocket, and rushed to my truck. I started it up, the engine roaring to life, and slowly backed out of the driveway. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing the winding road ahead. As I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in the back seat or following behind me. But there was nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. The anxiety that had been weighing me down lifted slightly, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't sure what had happened, or if I had imagined it all, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that cabin, ever. As I drove further away, the tension in my body slowly eased. It was a relief to be on my way home, but a part of me couldn't shake the thought that something, or someone, had been waiting for me in the woods. It was late October in the UK when I made the decision to rent a small, secluded cabin in the countryside for a weekend. I had been feeling the pressure of work and needed time to clear my head. The place I found was in the middle of nowhere, tucked away between thick woods and rolling hills. I had heard stories about the area being haunted, but I wasn't one to believe in those kinds of things. All I wanted was peace and quiet. The cabin itself was old, built in the 1800s. It had an old-world charm, but with modern amenities. I liked the fact that it was isolated, with no neighbors for miles. Just me, nature, and the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees. The first day I arrived, the weather was perfect, crisp and cold, with a clear sky that seemed to stretch forever. I unpacked my things and spent the rest of the afternoon hiking around, just enjoying the tranquility. There was no one else in sight, and the isolation felt comforting. It was the kind of peace that I hadn't known I was craving. But as evening came, things started to feel different. The temperature dropped quickly, and the once clear sky turned overcast. I made a fire in the wood stove and sat by it, reading a book I'd brought along. The house creaked as it settled, and I found myself glancing at the windows more often than usual. The night felt colder than it should have, even with the fire. At around 9:30, the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees. I noticed the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside the cabin, faint but unmistakable. My first thought was that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but it didn't seem right. The steps were too deliberate, too slow. I stood up and walked toward the window, peering through the blinds. The sight that met my eyes sent a shiver down my spine. There was a woman standing in the yard, maybe 30 feet away from the cabin. She was facing away from me, but even from this distance, I could see her long, dark hair that reached down to her waist. Her posture was odd, as though she was standing perfectly still, not moving at all. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out there in the dark, in the middle of nowhere? I stepped back from the window, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was probably just a local, maybe someone walking their dog or a hiker. But something about the way she was standing, so still, so motionless, didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my phone, about to call the owner of the cabin to ask if anyone was supposed to be in the area. But before I could hit the dial button, she moved. She didn't just walk away or turn around. She glided. The movement was unnatural, too smooth, almost like she wasn't walking at all but drifting just above the ground. I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to turn around and shut the blinds. But my eyes were fixed on her, captivated and terrified all at once. The woman moved slowly, her body seeming to bend at odd angles as if she was being pulled by some unseen force. I didn't understand what I was seeing. My mind tried to rationalize it, but nothing made sense. She didn't stop, didn't look around. She just moved straight toward the cabin, right up to the door. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly grabbed the nearest thing I could find, my jacket, and headed out the back door, hoping to find a safe place to hide. But as I stepped outside, the wind howled even louder, and the cold bit through my clothes. The woman was no longer in front of the cabin. In fact, the entire yard was empty. I took a few steps, my heart racing. My mind kept telling me to go back inside, to lock the doors and wait until morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stood there in the dark, listening. The only sound I could hear was the wind. And then, out of nowhere, the footsteps started again. They were louder this time, closer. I turned my head toward the sound, and there she was again, the woman now standing right behind me. She wasn't close enough for me to touch, but she was there. I could feel her presence, like a weight on my chest. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see her face. I was frozen, stuck in place, and I couldn't make myself move. Then the footsteps stopped. I felt the air grow colder, and I knew that she was right behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The hairs on my neck stood up as I tried to steady my breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered every ounce of courage I had. I took a deep breath, and I spun around to face her, but she wasn't there. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. No shadow, no movement, nothing. Just the eerie quiet of the countryside and the rustling of the wind. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the empty yard, too afraid to go back into the cabin. Eventually, I gathered myself and made my way back inside, locking every door and window behind me. The fire in the stove had burned down to nothing, but I didn't want to leave it. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath every time the wind picked up or I heard a strange noise. The rest of the night was uneventful. The wind died down, and the sky cleared up again. The strange feeling didn't go away, but as the hours passed, I convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. I eventually fell asleep, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's figure in my mind, standing in the yard. When morning came, I packed up and left the cabin before the sun had fully risen. I didn't want to stick around to find out who or what she had been. I didn't even stop to check if there was a reason for her being out there. All I knew was that I was never coming back to that cabin. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched the entire time. It was like she had been there, not just outside the cabin, but inside my mind too. The memory of her presence haunted me for days afterward. I never found out who she was or what she wanted, but every time I think back on that night, I can still feel the weight of her eyes on me, even though I never saw her face. It was late October when I decided to take a week off and head into the mountains. I had just turned 32 and needed a break from the grind of city life, something to clear my head. I rented a small cabin tucked in the remote foothills of the Rockies, near a place called Silver Lake in Colorado. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a small two-room structure with a wood stove and a few old, mismatched pieces of furniture. But it was the solitude I needed. I wasn't expecting much more than quiet, time to relax, maybe do a little hiking. The first day was great. I unpacked my things and settled in, took a walk around the property, and even caught a glimpse of a deer crossing the nearby creek. I didn't see anyone else for miles, just the sounds of wind rustling through the pines and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, but by the third day, things started to feel off. I woke up around 4 in the morning. The wind had picked up during the night, and it howled against the cabin. I rolled out of bed, made a pot of coffee, and sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the dim light. There was something strange about the way the wind moved, like it wasn't just the weather pushing the branches. It felt alive, almost as if something was making the trees move. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I sipped my coffee, I heard something in the distance. A low sound, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakable. It was a howl, different from any coyote or wolf I'd ever heard. It sent a chill down my spine. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a wolf, though the sound was off. Still, the howl sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't help but remember the stories I'd heard when I was younger. Stories about the skinwalkers in the nearby mountains. People who could shift into animals. Hunters who could take on the form of wolves or bears, and who were known to stalk lone travelers in the wilderness. I'd always written it off as superstition, but that howl, it sounded different. I decided to head out for a hike, hoping the fresh air would calm my nerves. I grabbed my jacket, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and stepped outside. The wind was bitter cold, and the gray clouds loomed overhead, but I figured I could handle a few hours of hiking. The trail started just behind the cabin and wound through the dense forest before leading up to the cliffs above Silver Lake. I hadn't planned to hike that far, but I felt a need to get away from the cabin for a while. The trail was narrow, and the woods felt thick and suffocating. There were no other hikers, no signs of life. It was eerie, but I kept walking, telling myself it was just my nerves getting to me. About 2 hours into the hike, I came across a clearing. The wind was stronger now, and I could feel it in my bones. It was then that I noticed the tracks in the snow. They weren't human. They were too wide, and the shape was wrong. At first glance, I thought they were from a large animal, maybe a bear, but something about them didn't sit right with me. They were too spaced out, too deliberate, like whatever had made them was walking on 2 legs, but not quite human. I crouched down, inspecting the tracks. They were deep in the snow, as if the animal had a heavy, muscular body. My heart started to race. I quickly stood up and backed away from the clearing. The wind picked up again, whipping through the trees, and I felt a sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to head back to the cabin, thinking I'd take a different route to avoid the strange tracks. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and I didn't want to be caught out after dark. As I made my way back, I heard the howl again, louder this time, closer. It echoed through the forest, sending a cold shiver through my spine. This time it sounded different, almost like it was mimicking the sound of a human scream. I picked up my pace, my boots crunching in the snow, heart pounding. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But as I sat by the fire, I kept hearing noises outside, scratching sounds, like something was trying to claw its way into the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it out the window, but I didn't see anything. Still, I could feel the presence of something just outside, moving around in the dark. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it was impossible. The fear was growing inside me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I started to think about those stories from when I was younger, about the skinwalkers. They were said to mimic the sounds of people, to lure travelers away from safety before attacking. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like it was part of something bigger. I felt trapped, isolated. I spent the night by the stove, clutching my flashlight, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, I decided to leave. I didn't care about finishing my trip. I just wanted to get out of the woods. As I packed my things, I glanced out the window one last time and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the distance, standing on the edge of the trees, was a figure. It wasn't quite human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too crooked. It was standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. My stomach turned, and I felt my heart racing. I grabbed my things and fled. As I drove away from the cabin, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a good 2 hours away. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was out there, something that wasn't human. The howl still echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a bad night in the woods. Something that had been watching me, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. And as far as I'm concerned, I never want to know what it was that I saw in the woods that night. I had never planned on spending a night in the middle of nowhere, on a farm, at an old, rundown cabin, but that's exactly where I found myself. I had always wanted to experience the quiet solitude of rural life, far from the noise and distractions of city living. So, when a friend of mine, Liam, mentioned his family had a cabin on a farm just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a short escape. It was a late October weekend, and the weather was starting to cool off as autumn settled in. The trees on the long drive leading up to the farm had lost most of their leaves, leaving behind bare branches that reached toward the sky like twisted fingers. The farm itself was well hidden, tucked away behind a cluster of dense woods and fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of place where the world felt distant, and you could hear the wind whispering through the grass and trees if you stopped long enough to listen. When I arrived, I was taken aback by how remote the cabin felt. It was the kind of structure you'd expect to find in an old Western movie. Weathered wood, a creaky porch, and a chimney that barely seemed to work. The place looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, but Liam assured me it was perfectly fine. His family used to come out here for weekends, but now it was mostly left alone. I didn't think much of it. I was used to roughing it, but there was something about the place that set me on edge. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the wind seemed to howl in the trees, making everything sound louder than it really was. There was also the strange quietness inside the cabin. No birds singing, no animals scurrying around. Just an eerie stillness that seemed unnatural for a farm. The air felt heavy, and the smell of mildew hung in the corners of the room. After I unpacked my things and settled in, I decided to head outside and take a walk around the property. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows over the fields. It was peaceful in a way, but as I walked further, I began to notice strange things. There was a rustling in the bushes, but when I looked, nothing was there. I chalked it up to animals, but it didn't sit right with me. I wandered to the edge of the farm where an old barn stood in the distance. The barn was much bigger than I'd imagined. Its roof sagged under the weight of time, and the door was half open, as if inviting me inside. I could feel a sense of unease growing in my chest. It was a combination of instinct and something else I couldn't quite place. But still, I walked closer. When I reached the barn, I stood at the entrance for a moment, just staring inside. The air felt colder here. The faint smell of hay and dirt drifted out, and I could hear what sounded like a low thud, as if something had shifted within. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature that had made its way inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I walked around the barn and checked the windows, but everything seemed locked up. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way back to the cabin. The woods around me seemed thicker now, like the trees were closing in, and I could have sworn I heard footsteps following me, though I quickly dismissed it as my imagination. When I got back to the cabin, the sky had darkened entirely, and a chill had settled in the air. I made a fire in the small stone fireplace, but it did little to warm the place. As the flames flickered, I could hear the wind picking up again, this time louder and more aggressive. It howled around the cabin, rattling the windows and making the roof creak. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I kept hearing noises from outside, little things, scratching sounds against the walls, faint thuds that I couldn't explain. Eventually, the unease I'd been feeling all day turned into something more palpable, something I couldn't ignore. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would help. The bed was old and creaky, the blankets thin and threadbare, but I didn't care. I was too tired to worry about comfort. As I lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, the sounds from outside continued. The wind, the scratching, the thudding, all of it kept me awake. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that froze me in place. It wasn't the wind or anything natural. It was a heavy, deliberate knock on the front door. I lay there, barely breathing, straining to hear. The knock came again, louder this time. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't shake. I got out of bed slowly, trying to move quietly, and crept toward the front door. I peered through the small, cracked window next to the door, but I saw nothing. No one was there. I don't know why I opened the door. Maybe I thought I was imagining things. But when I stepped outside, there was no sign of anyone. The night was silent now, the wind having died down completely. It was as if the world had paused for a moment. I stood there for a while, listening, but heard nothing. Feeling foolish, I turned back to the cabin and went inside. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something strange. An old, rusted chain had been left on the ground, right next to the door. It was too big to be from anything I owned, and it wasn't something I'd seen before. A cold dread washed over me. Felt like someone had been watching me. Someone had been waiting. I hurriedly locked the door, then backed away from it, my eyes fixed on the cabin's windows. The wind started up again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the soft rustling from before. This time it was like the trees were groaning, creaking with a purpose. I grabbed my phone, trying to call Liam, but there was no signal. My heart pounded as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something I didn't want to meet. The unease I had been feeling all day was finally settling in as fear. I spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, never once feeling safe enough to sit or sleep. The chain was the only clue, but it felt like a message I couldn't read. Who had been out there, and why had they left it behind? By the time morning came, the sun had risen over the horizon, casting the first light of day over the farm. The world felt quieter, more normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had been watching me through the dark night. I packed my things quickly, not caring that I hadn't slept at all. As I was about to leave, I took one last look at the cabin, and that's when I saw it. The same chain was now wrapped around the porch railing. I left without a second thought, my heart still racing. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't want to. I just knew that whatever it was, I didn't want to be anywhere near that farm again.